Hey friends, thanks for joining us. I have a very special guest on the line. It's Hattrick Penry. You guys would know him from his YouTube channel and his work on Fukushima. The YouTube channel is Hattrick Penry. Hattrick, thanks for taking the time to meet with us.
I appreciate it, man. It's an honor to be here, and thank you for the opportunity.
Well, it's my pleasure. At SGT Report, all we care about is trying to get to the core of the truth, and we've been on the Fukushima story since the day that tsunami and earthquake devastated Japan. So much has transpired since then. It's hard to really know what truthfully has transpired and how bad the situation is. I had Helen Caldicott on the program February 13th, and about midway through that interview, I brought your name up. And first, so everybody knows, Helen, I think, is on the side of truth. I'm just not sure how well-versed she is in your work. And according to Helen, at this point, there is, quote, no best-case scenario for Fukushima, just worsening degrees of horror because it's scientifically impossible to clean up what has already occurred. And with thousands of spent fuel rods and thousands more active fuel rods still in the fuel pools of the damaged reactor buildings, the worst-case scenario, if another major earthquake were to hit the area, is potentially an ecological nightmare of biblical proportions for everyone living in the Northern Hemisphere. And I wanted to invite Hattrick onto the show here to address the FOIA documents that he's found, to address all of his research the best we can in, a half hour here. I want to start by playing this exchange between Helen and I, just to set the stage as to why we wanted to have Hattrick Penry on. Do you think we would ever know the truth of what's going on there? And the reason I ask is because we've seen coverage in the national news media here in the United States from ABC News and others that take video cameras in, saying that they're being given exclusive access to number 4 in the removal of the fuel rods, which is said to have begun. And what we see in the video being shared here in America is a pristine interior building. It doesn't look like a building in which the top blew off in a hydrogen explosion. There are many out there, like Hattrick Penry. I sent you a PDF document, a 445-page PDF document called Plumegate. I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at that. But there are many that have looked at the Freedom of Information Act documents.
I've read it.
Okay, what's your take? Can we believe anything coming out of Japan, out of TEPCO, or out of the American news media?
Yes, and I think Patrick Hendrick goes too far, and I don't agree with some of the stuff he says. You've got to be really up to date with your facts.
So Hattrick Penry, thanks so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it. I spoke with Helen Caldicott. I brought your name up to her. She said she had read your 445-page PDF called Plumegate. I've only gotten through about 180 pages of it, but I wanted to give you the opportunity to take the stage. Where would you like to begin? You want to begin with the explosions of reactors 3 and 4, or you start wherever you want?
I'll be happy to discuss Units 3 and Units 4, and specifically what I talk about, what I have knowledge of, are the instances what happened to these spent fuel pools. Early on in these documents, it's very clear that the damage was catastrophic to the spent fuel pools. In the case of Unit 3, you can see HD pictures online if you dig around, and you can visibly see there's no walls on the spent fuel pool. On Unit 4, they discuss a crack and the drainage of the coolant from the spent fuel pool. And at some point, it's like any of these initial events, you can get a lot of truth out of what initially comes out. At some point in these documents, TEPCO begins to give the NRC a hard time, and they want them to recant and say there is water in Unit 4 in the spent fuel pool. And the point being with these documents is there's a mountain of evidence well past 5, 6, 7, 8 days where they're still worried that the spent fuel of Unit 4, they know it's melted down, and they're running calculations, naval reactors and NRC, to find out, is that hot corium blob of the spent fuel going to sublimate through the floor of the spent fuel pool? And there's a back and forth in another section of doc. They're worried about it melting through down to the torus below. So the concern, even as far as the 21st of March 2011, centered around the Unit 4 spent fuel pool, and did that melted fuel burn through the bottom of the spent fuel pool? So what's important about my book and the abstract I have out now that I would implore Helen Caldicott to dig deep into is just this massive amount of evidence that stands in stark contrast to the official story. And I don't want to fearmonger either, but I suspect that the evidence indicates that the worst of the worst, a true worst case scenario, meaning, and this was also shown in President's worst case scenario he called for, that was a model that was run on 3 reactor meltdowns and 4 spent fuel pool meltdowns. And that would be the logical conclusion to a complete loss of power and the earthquake and tsunami damage, saltwater inundation of electrical components. Even if you had brought power back by some magical means, you'd have still had damaged circuitry and other electronics that would be damaged by salt water. So you see there was no easy fix. It was a worst case scenario, and they knew that early on. And I might add briefly, it wasn't just this 72-hour quote unquote fog of war type situation where they say, hey, we got it wrong, we made an honest mistake. I've shown in the documents that Jennifer Uhl is still having back and forth discussions with naval reactors about, is the spent fuel going to sublimate through the concrete? So they were still, weeks into it, concerned with that Unit 4. And Unit 3 is kind of not as much info in there, but I might say it. We know it had MOX fuel, and we know the Canadians were concerned in a part of these documents where they say, hey, you guys didn't calculate for your dose rates for Unit 3 the fact it had MOX fuel in it. And they wanted the NRC to redo their calculations. And the guy says, we'll discuss it later in a phone call. So I don't know if they ever did that. But that's a summation of Units 3 and 4 for you right there.
Now, the point I was trying to make to Helen, and I wanted her opinion on it because I do respect her as a scientist, and she is studied in this area. But even as a layman like I am, it seems to me that based on the video of the explosions of Unit 3 and then the really massive explosion of Unit 4, that was the larger explosion, wasn't it, Hatrick?
That's difficult for me to say. I haven't really taken the time to compare. I've seen both videos kind of separately, and either one, like you're saying, it is a massive concussive force that in these documents they say particles of fuel pellets have been blown out of Unit 4 and Unit 3 and are spread across the ground of the facility. They mention dose rates between 3 and 4, 500 rem an hour. So we can clearly see in these documents that, like you say, visually we see the explosion, and then confirmed in these documents just the damage is absolutely catastrophic.
And even more so if you understand that these GE plants, this model of plant, is the type of plant in which spent fuel rods are stored on top of the reactor building. And if the buildings blow sky high, then you'd have to surmise that all of those spent fuel rods also blew up and are unrecoverable and have spewed endless amounts of radiation into the environment and potentially into the ocean. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, or would you prefer to talk about the fuel pools? Because that was my other question for Helen, is when we see on television, ABC News or others, getting exclusive access to these buildings, which appear to be pristine on the inside, I don't think that adds up. That does not look possible to me. That looks like different reactor buildings than 3 or 4. What's your take on that?
Well, the possibility certainly exists. We know there's a Unit 5 and Unit 6 that did not suffer the same amount of damage as the others. Again, information is sketchy and we don't know who to believe 100%, but is it not possible they are filming there down at Diani, another facility south of Fukushima, that maybe suffered damage, and they'll show you the spent fuel pool and you can see some debris a little bit of cloudiness. But that's not the same spent fuel pool indicated in these documents and the conditions in these documents. And might I add, a number of NRC officials did not recant their story to my knowledge. Chuck Castro, John Moniger, a couple of these guys, to my knowledge, have not recanted their initial assessment. I've never seen in these documents them come back and change it. It's Jaxco that came back initially, stood before Congress and said the spent fuel pool was dry, according to what I read in these documents. Anyway, I haven't seen that film footage of him in Congress, but apparently he said, yes, it was dry. Then they recanted when TEPCO put pressure on them, and I'm sure our government put pressure too, and then came the flip-flop that the pool has water in it. We made an honest mistake. But again, in these documents, I show many weeks in, they're still concerned about the heat up in Unit 4. And did it sublimate through the concrete? And so I might add that in a public meeting in California in September of 2013, NRC official Jennifer Uhl, U-H-L-E is how you spell her last name, she's stating to the public that there was no spent fuel pool heat up in any of the pools affected at Fukushima, which is just, it's jaw dropping, because in these documents that flies in the face of everything that is shown in these NRC FOIA documents, which are free and publicly available. Anyone can dig around in there and read this stuff.
Well, and that's what you've done, and that's why we wanted to get you on. We want to spread the word and encourage people to take a look at your new abstract, which is a revised, it's really a cut down of your 445-page PDF document called Plumegate. And it's just a massive amount of work. This citizen journalism movement that's happening, that has really been sparked by guys like Luke Rudkowski at We Are Change. We see Ben Swan having so much success, sinking his teeth into the alternative media. What you are doing and what you have done is you have collected these FOIA documents and put them in one place so that people can read them and people can have access to the truth. And that's why I think your work's important, and I wanted to get you on. Let's talk now just a little bit about the removal of the fuel rods from the fuel pools. Even if there's water in the pools of 3 and 4, let's assume they haven't suffered a great deal of damage. I believe they have. Let's say they haven't. I think it was Arnie Gunderson who made the point that if you imagine those rods being just millimeters apart, imagine a damaged pack of cigarettes. And if just the bottom part is crinked, if any of those rods are crinked anywhere, they can't be removed. They can't be pulled out safely. And what is your take on the removal of these fuel rods? Have you been following the news? Do you think it's happening? Do you think it's even possible?
Well, again, I'm very skeptical, and I would just compare solar power to nuclear power. I read an article the other day where a small town has basically most of the houses anyway have solar power. This town is producing enough energy via solar power that they're selling it back to the utility companies, so they have energy and they're also making money from it. And if you look at examples like that, if you look at some of these reports, I believe the Union of Concerned Scientists did a report where they said over 5,000 patents are being suppressed in the United States. Solar cells with 80% or greater efficiency, they can seize the patents or hold the patents. And so if you look at that and then you look at nuclear power and say, just the fact you're telling me that they have this delicate operation to pull these most dangerous rods out, in the circumstances, the environment surrounding that situation is so precision oriented and so razor edge difficult and dangerous. This is simply flies in the face of all logic that we would use nuclear as a means of energy production. It's a very dangerous a way of producing power, as Einstein said, a hell of a way to boil water. And Fukushima proves beyond any reasonable doubt that a worst case scenario is possible, and there can be a multiple criticalities, not just one like in Chernobyl. We can have 3 reactors, 4 spent fuel pools. It flies in the face of all logic to use this as a means of energy production, except for the fact that it is an energy monopoly. Hence, you or I cannot build a nuclear reactor in our backyard and produce power via that means. However, we can install solar panels. I read another article, you can spray this paint on the outside of your house, hook up your electrodes, and the paint is like a solar cell energy production means. So it just boggles my mind. Other than nuclear weapons and the monopoly, there's no reason for anyone, and I'm against nuclear weapons and I'm against energy monopolies, but that's my logic why this archaic means of power continues.